Okay, we are going to get started and let people file in as they can. Hi, everyone. I'm Annalea Arnold, Executive Director for the Alliance of Women Directors. Thank you for joining us for our conversation today to discuss this marvelous film, CODA, with writer-director Siân Heder and our moderator, Director Tara Miele. Before we get started, just want to give you some quick reminders. The live transcription and closed captioning has been enabled for this conversation. Please opt in by selecting the live transcription option at the bottom right of your screen. The chat feature is turned off, but questions can be entered into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them towards the end of the panel as we have time. We ask that you remember to keep questions to today's topic. We want to thank our friends at Apple TV Plus for making this panel possible. And with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Siân and Tara. Tara, take it away.
Hi, everybody. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I have known Siân, I have the pleasure of knowing Siân for maybe a decade or so, somewhere around there. And, you know, we were like coming up together as filmmakers. And so it's been really beautiful to watch her work grow and evolve over the years. And I'm such an incredible fan. So Siân, I have to just say thank you for this film. I feel like in the midst of the pandemic, it was like exactly what I didn't know I needed. And it has that magic that I think all filmmakers strive for, which is this sort of grounded authenticity and this patience. There's such a confidence about the way that you approach this film. So I'm just thrilled. I mean, I just feel like you have like recracked sort of like a heartfelt narrative in a way that we haven't seen in many years. You know, like films like Terms of Endearment used to win Oscars, and suddenly we're in this like violent like mayhem of movies, and you really, it's like a gift that you've made this film. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I was looking to a lot of those films, I think, as I was thinking about the film when I started. And so it's nice to hear people say that, because I think it was a kind of throwback story in a lot of ways.
Well, and the trick with those kinds of movies is that it feels so effortless. Like it feels like it just sort of happened and like was just sort of captured. And so today we're going to dig into how incredibly hard it must have been to make it all look effortless.
A little bit.
I know how this goes, you know. So why don't you tell us, just to start, how did this project come to you? It was based on the French film, which I won't say the name because I'll butcher it. Because
you're gonna make me butcher it because you won't say it. So here is my bad French accent. It was called La Famille Bellier.
That sounds good. Good job.
Sure. But I'd been at Sundance with Tallulah, which was my first feature, and I had just come back from Sundance really, and was kind of looking for what my next project was going to be. And originally it was a studio movie, and it was set up at Lionsgate, and they had the rights to do a remake to this French film. And I was very suspicious about a remake, because I think remakes are all sorts of traps, right? You know, either like the original is so good that you don't want to touch it, or there's not enough there, or why is a remake happening? And so, and then I watched the film, and I found the premise very moving, you know, the idea of a CODA, that character, and really the idea that a lot of CODAs grow up, you know, within deaf culture, and that feels like their community and their culture. And oftentimes ASL is their first language, and then yet they're hearing people, and they have to navigate the deaf world and the hearing world and kind of be the conduit between those worlds. And so that character had so much potential for me. And there were a lot of beautiful moments. I think in the original film, the tone was super different than what I made. It was very kind of broad comedy. And, you know, and they cast hearing actors to play deaf, which was incredibly problematic. And not only was it problematic, it also didn't allow for the language to live on screen, or the culture to live on screen in a way that really felt authentic and deep. So for me, there was just so many opportunities. It was like, oh, the story is such a great kernel of a story, and yet there's so much room to explore and to make it personal. And I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is about 50 minutes away from Gloucester. So I would go up there every summer as a kid, and I had seen what had happened kind of to the fishing community there, and how decimated that community had been over the years, and how people were losing their livelihoods, and the town was changing, and watching the waterfront kind of get shut down, and a lot of abandoned fish processing plants, and a lot of, you know, that whole industry was collapsing. And those guys are such characters that I really just had this vision of the Rossis as this Gloucester Cape Ann fishing family. And it felt really exciting to also make the town a character in the film. And so I wrote the movie, developed it in the studio, and it became really clear as we were developing the project that the movie that I wanted to make and the movie the studio wanted to make were not the same movie, maybe. And that also the things that I was fighting for, which was to cast deaf actors and to, have ASL be a good portion of the movie and have it be subtitled, not have Ruby speak through all of those scenes, like sort of all these kind of mini battles along the way. And then it seemed like it just wasn't the right fit with the studio. And so it sort of died there. I mean, it seemed like it wasn't going to happen. And then Patrick Washburger left the studio and he took the movie with him as part of his exit package as he was leaving, and then set it up independently. And we made it much smaller movie, completely independently, no distribution, out in Gloucester, Mass. So it was interesting to start within that system and then to really end up with like a purely independent movie,
which is now a big studio
movie. So it went right back around, but the upside of it was that I got to make exactly the movie I wanted to make in the way I wanted to make it. And that, I was allowed to have 40% of the movie be in ASL and have those scenes be silent and not fill them with music and not do kind of all these things that I imagine had I made it within the studio system would have happened. So
right.
It was the right path ultimately, but it's hard when you're in it to feel that way.
Right. And hard when you've got like, especially I think coming off of like your first Sundance feature.
Yeah.
Feeling like, okay, there's this opportunity and there's this studio size thing and you have this personal call to it now and it's become yours. And then there's all these voices fighting against. And so I'm curious about like navigating that. Like in a way, it was this kind of lucky thing that it fell out of there. But how far along the fight were you, or were you sort of dialed out of it by the time it all fell apart and then came back to you?
I was ready to watch the movie not get made at the point that I was having all those battles, because I think, look, when you're a filmmaker trying to get your movie made, you're always making compromises, right? Or you're always entertaining compromises, at least, whether you make them or not, whether it's a piece of casting that'll get your financing triggered, whether it's giving up the location you want, whether it's changing story elements. So it's sometimes hard to know what are the things that you can push forward and that'll be the thing that triggers getting your movie made and you can still make a great movie. And what are the things that compromise your movie to the point that it shouldn't get made? In some of the conversations we were having, it felt like conversations that would have compromised the movie to be a movie I didn't want to make. There was no way I was going to make this movie without deaf actors playing those deaf characters. There was no way I was going to have Ruby voice through the whole scene. It was just, to me, it was completely unrealistic.
Lack of authenticity and groundedness and all the things.
I'm like, why would she be talking to her deaf parents? That makes no sense. That is purely for a hearing audience to make them comfortable or make that, it's like, so there were all these things that I felt like I had gotten to a point where I was like, this is how I want to make this movie. And if it's not going to get made that way, then I'd rather see it not get made. And so it was a blessing when it could be extricated from the studio, which is not an easy process all the time. And I'm so glad that, but it was at a point where it was kind of like, well, that version where like Ruby's a pop star and, the parent, it's like, I don't want to make that movie, or that's not a place I want to put my energy. It doesn't feel like the right way to tell the story. So those are always hard when you're inside of it, because sometimes you feel like, I don't know, could Taylor Swift be a good Ruby? Maybe. I don't know.
Right. Yes, right. Exactly.
Could be genius, but I don't think so.
Right.
So I think.
Well, so talk about that casting process then, and finding Amelia and the conversation even about financing on the indie side with a cast that's not Taylor Swift, because it's not easy for anyone, including Taylor Swift these days.
Including Taylor Swift, who's amazing, by the way.
Love Taylor. Saw her at Sundance in 2020. She's amazing. Amazing.
But I think that, the casting was interesting. I mean, I like in writing the script, I part of my deep dive into deaf culture because I was an outsider coming into this culture. And I felt like there's no way I should be presenting this story without deaf collaborators and people that are really helping me every step of the way to have a deaf perspective on the script, on everything. And so early on, I also started going to Deaf West Plays, which is a theater company in Los Angeles that does collaborations between deaf artists and hearing artists. And these plays are incredible. And it was part of working with DJ Kurz, who was the artistic director of Deaf West, to really find deaf talent as well. And Troy Kotzer, who plays Frank, I saw on stage in 2 different productions at Deaf West. So I was in love with him. Like from the moment that I saw him on stage, I was like, this guy is so charismatic and handsome, weird and quirky.
Wonderful.
And so I sort of had him in the back of my mind as like, I think that might be my Frank. And then I met with Marlee Matlin, and she and I hit it off completely, you know, and we had a 3-hour breakfast where we talked and just really explored the character and the world and who was this woman and what was her story. And I remember in that meeting, she said, well, who are you thinking of for Frank? And I said, well, who do you know who you think could be Frank? And she said, well, there's this actor, Troy Kotzer. And I'm like, I know, I've seen him on stage and I'm obsessed with him. So I think we both kind of had that moment with Troy. With Daniel, you know, I just saw there were a lot of deaf actors at that age who were great. Like there were a lot of choices for that Leo character. And Daniel just felt like he tapped into that guy and his anger and frustration and all of that kind of was great. Amelia was the hardest to find because, you know, I was looking for, I remember my casting director, Deb Aquila, was like, you know, you're looking for a unicorn here. Like you're trying to find someone who can like sign, who can sing, who's going to go fishing, who's going to, you know. And so I saw maybe 100 girls for that part. That's what I saw. My casting director saw
thousands.
We looked for a real CODA, and then we couldn't find someone who could sing and act. We looked for singers, you know, who were maybe going to act. Like, it was just like, how do we find all of these things in one person? Because I hate in film when someone is supposed to have some amazing talent and that talent doesn't strike the audience that way as well. And so I was looking for this voice. She's in almost every scene of the movie. I wanted her to be authentically 17 or around that age, because when I started seeing girls, that's such a tenuous age. And when you even see like a 22-year-old, something's changed, you know,
and often it's like that 22-year-old is right out of like theater school or something. Yes. There's something that's happened in that period where they've gotten trained and they're no longer 17.
Even Amelia is 19 now. And those 2 years, like, I'm like, she's a different person. She was suspended between childhood and adulthood, like right at that moment when we worked together. And now she's like fully an adult and in the world, you know, very self-possessed. But there was something about her being that age. And then, you know, there was just many elements to that audition. Like I had singing auditions where people sang multiple songs. I had a deaf friend record a signed scene and sent, and she signed, and I watched her tape. And the signing was actually the thing really that caught me about her, because she had never signed before. But it's a language that people take too naturally or don't, you know, there are natural signers. There's a way, you know, I've been studying sign for a long time now. I don't know that I am a natural signer. Like there's rhythms to it. There's a way of being very expressive within the language. It's very so different. And Amelia, I remember my friend having a couple of deaf people watch her tape and go, what's so interesting is her sign shape is wrong. You know, like she hasn't learned the right signs. And yet she looks like a natural signer. Like she looks like she has
the dance of it. They're like her
confidence, the rhythm, the kind of expressiveness, because so much of it is using your face. It's using the space around your body. It's the way you inhabit emotionally the signs that you're signing. So it was a funny thing. It was like, I remember at that point I was choosing between 2 girls, and they said, well, this girl is more accurate with her sign shape and she's not inhabiting the language. Like it doesn't feel like it's hers. Whereas Amelia, she feels like this is her language. She just hasn't learned how to use it yet. And I thought that was really important. And then she studied for 9 months with a deaf coach in Toronto where she was working, who taught her sign language and taught her deaf culture and really tried to get her inside of this character. And then Eugenio was really the stroke of casting that also triggered getting the film made, because he is the biggest star in Latin America and he was brilliant. And I met him and I thought, oh, wow, this is kind of the perfect combination of somebody who is, you know, a big star and yet largely unknown as an actor in this country. And so he gets to be a discovery and he gets to be this kind of valuable asset in terms of like triggering the movie.
The money.
And I love him. And I love that he's a comedian and he was really wanting to do more serious work and just saw an opportunity with this character to dig in and do something dramatic and different for him. And so I was so lucky with this cast. I mean, it was an
incredible cast.
Yeah.
Incredible cast. So, and then can you talk, because I want to come back to the sign language, but can you talk for a second about your own experience with signing? So like when you're going to sit down with Marley, are you fluent in ASL?
No, I mean, I would say now I'm conversational, like I can have a conversation, but no, I'm not fluent. And so when I started writing the script, I started taking ASL class. One, because it was a way to meet a deaf teacher and start to get in with the deaf community and sort of be introduced to more people. And, but also just because I knew that I wanted half the movie to be in sign language. I knew that I wanted to do that translation, have an understanding of the language and culture. I felt like, you know, eventually I was going to be directing deaf actors on set, and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't solely relying on an interpreter for that. Right. So I started studying. No, when I met Marley has an interpreter, Jack, who has been with her for 35 years, who comes with her everywhere. And so I was using interpreters in the audition process. I was using interpreters in Zoom meetings when I was meeting my actors. With Daniel, I was Zooming with. Troy, I met in person. Daniel lived in Detroit. But it was interesting because I found that when I got on set, I really had a hard time relying on an interpreter, because that is such an intimate relationship. And, you know, like that moment, you've got a fraction of a moment between when you watch a take and you go up and you need to give the actor something, you know, and the idea that my words had to be so perfect that then an interpreter who's not in the business, who's not a creative person, who's not in those conversations all the time, was going to choose the right words. I mean, I've been in conversations with hearing actors where I've said a word that means something to me and it means something different to them. And you watch the performance go off the rails and you're like, whoa, that's not what I meant. So I feel like that communication is so key, and that trust is so key. And the first day we were using an interpreter, and I think, you know, we were like 2 takes in. And the other thing was that I think I was directing Daniel, and Daniel was looking at the interpreter and not looking at me, because that's what you need to do to receive the language. And I'm doing so much on my face and so much like through my eyes, and I'm very expressive when I talk. And so basically I was at that point where I said, I went up to Marley and Troy and Daniel and I said, you guys, can I just sign with you directly? And it might be really messy, and I might, you know, maybe we'll get lost and maybe I won't know the right signs or whatever, but then we at least have that connection and we're communicating directly. And then I'll have the interpreter like right on my shoulder. So if we get confused, if something is unclear, there's someone's right there to jump in. But I really want that. And they really wanted that. And immediately they were all like, oh my God, yes, let's do that. Because I think they were feeling frustrated too. And we did that. And it was amazing because we just found a way. Like I found a way to communicate what I needed to communicate. And so did they. And like my sign was like, by the time we were at the wrap party, you know, people were joking that I was like interpreting in the middle of conversations, because nothing makes
part of you. You were like dreaming in ASL, right? That's how you know when you're fluent.
I just had my first dream in ASL actually. When I was signing. But nothing makes you learn faster than like a desperate need to communicate an idea, so and especially in terms of acting language, when you're talking about character, you're talking about like when I would learn a sign that would mean something very specific in terms of performance, then that became a shorthand with the actor and the sign was like drilled into my head. And so then we would be using that when we chatted about the character, and then we found the interpreters also who could hang in the middle of that conversation. So then it became like, okay, this interpreter is maybe best in the makeup trailer, and this is the person that I can take with me who can be in the middle of that actor director conversation when we do need to elaborate more.
But it's interesting, like every point along the way, and I feel like this is every director's journey, but in this one in particular, it's like having to sort of, plant your flag in authenticity, plant your flag in like the groundedness of what this needs to be, and in connection and in intimacy, right? Like, so even like you have this intimate moment for the actors on screen, but like without like a really intimate connection to you just off camera,
Yes.
It doesn't go the direction it needs to go, right? The river doesn't flow in the direction it needs to go. And then they're not all connecting where they need to connect.
And there were two very, very key people to me in this process. So Anne Tomasetti and Alexandria Wales were my ASL masters, or my directors of artistic sign language. And what that role is, Alexandria worked with me in prep, and she basically did the translation of the script, and there's no written form of ASL. So you are literally sitting there with the script and going line by line, and we're just discussing every piece of dialogue. And we actually recently, I just saw her in New York, and we were laughing that we did this without an interpreter. So and I was like, I didn't even remember that we didn't have an interpreter there, but we just met and had these intense discussions about the script.
Wonderful.
And part of it was like, I had been learning in the language at that point. So it was sort of looking at a line, and then also her asking me like, what is your intention? Like, what's underneath this for the character? What are they really saying? Because there's a million sign choices. It's not like a one-to-one. The languages are so different that you really have to understand, like, what's the joke, or like, what's the deeper meaning, or what's the emotion behind this, or intention, to be able to make sign choices. And then a lot of times it wasn't a sign choice that I felt like worked expressively for the moment. So I remember I had written a line like, I think Ruby said, "Do you want me to die here?" And like the sign for die is that. And it's like, it's not the most, it's sort of like a flop, you know what I mean? And it's not the most passive, it's a little passive. And then I remember sort of being like, hey, like, is there something, she's really angry in that moment. And she said, well, kill is like a more like, this is killing me, might be a way for, and that engaged the actress's whole,
like you can feel her like,
and so we would just work like through the script on those, and the script changed a lot in that process, because she'd be like, this is too English, no deaf person would say this. There were just cultural kind of, just a translation culturally too that was happening. And then Anne Tomasetti took over on set, and she was with me at the monitor every step of the way, because of course, I'm watching performance, but at that point, I don't know if Troy is adding secret fucks into his line, and I'm trying to get a PG-13 rating, and Troy's, adding little fucks in the middle of the line. He's signing really quickly, and I don't know, or, an actor flubs their lines because the sign is unclear and I don't catch it. And so Anne was there kind of working with the actors. And also there's regionalisms to sign language in the way that there's an accent. So there are signs that are used in Cape Ann and Gloucester that aren't used anywhere else.
I mean, just like language, right? Like they're saying Dunkies, not Dunkin' Donuts. It's like whatever you have to do.
Totally. So there's slang, there's regionalisms, there's the name sign for Gloucester, which is like a little G in the air, which is like locals would use that, but you would never know that that was the name of the town unless you were a deaf person who lived in Gloucester. So a lot of that was like that really specific work, so that, it felt authentic in that way, that there's a local sign for lobster, there's a local sign for a lot of like these things that, so the assumption that these actors are coming in and like, because they're deaf, they're going to know how their character, like a dialect coach would work with anybody. Marley was like, I don't sign like Jackie. Jackie is a Fisher wife in Gloucester. Like she's going to sign differently. So sort of Marley came in with her sign choices, but then she'd work with Anne and work with Alexandria to kind of figure out like, who's this character? And maybe Ruby signs more like her dad because there's more of a connection there. So just like you would gravitate towards one parent, like their signing style might be more similar than she would be with her mom because she's a little disconnected from her mom. So those two women were so key for me. Like they were my deaf eyes on set. I relied on Anne, you know, when my actors would improvise because I wanted them to be free to improvise. And there were so many improv moments that Anne would just be furiously scribbling down notes for my editor. And, you know, so that we would know like, what are these little moments and gems that we're finding? And I think the actors were so appreciative too, that there was so much freedom to improvise, because I think normally if you're the only deaf actor, and especially if you're acting opposite a hearing person who's maybe learned some sign for the role, you don't get to go off script. You know, they only know their lines or they only know the signs that you're signing and you have to deliver that. So I think for Troy and Daniel and Marley, it was a very freeing experience to be in a, you know, our set was taken over by the culture of ASL. The crew started signing, you know, Amelia and I would be signing when there were, you know, when deaf actors weren't working, because it was a great language to have that felt private.
Right.
Between us. So that was, I don't know. It was a cool.
I mean, it's so interesting because I think, you know, it's often like the thing that we face down in whatever movie we're on, whatever film we're on, that's the biggest challenge then becomes the greatest opportunity. The thing that's the most difficult about something, and the dance of the ASL in the film, the rhythms of it, the dynamism of it, you know, it's that thing where the studio is afraid of having people sign the whole time, and yet people signing the whole time is the most compelling piece of the film,
movie.
Right? Yeah. So I want to look at that clip that we talked about, the sex talk clip. And then we can talk about how it evolved from maybe the script to what we actually see. So I think Analia can do that for us. Maybe she can bring that up.
Sure. Do you want to set it up a little bit before I bring it in? Is this the living room sex talk one?
This is go ahead. You go ahead.
Well, this is Ruby has brought a kid she likes, Miles, home to rehearse. They're in choir together and she's caught her parents having sex. And this is her parents sort of having this awkward sex talk with her and her crush.
Fabulous. Here we go.
Dad, no. Oh my God, Miles, go.
Nice to meet you.
Just please go. I hate you.
I think we lost a little bit because of the compression of it, but tell us, because I know that Troy is so incredible in that scene. And so tell me what happened. How did this all go down?
Well, he's just an incredible signer in general. I mean, within the deaf community, he is renowned for being an incredible signer. He's very inventive with his sign choice. He's expressive in a way that, as you see, you know, for example, there's another scene, you know, where later in the movie, I think I had written, I'd give my left nut to tell those guys to go screw off or whatever. And Troy like made the nuts and then he like pulled one off and then he like pulled a pin out of it like it was a grenade, like threw it over his shoulder. It exploded in the background. He blocked his ears because this explosion happened. Like, and it's the way that ASL can be expressive that English cannot be, you know. And I think what was so fun for me is writing a line, you know, and having him kind of take the line absorb it and we would chat about it. And then these kind of creations would come out of him. I mean, I had many conversations with the MPA about the scene that we just watched. Because it is like, well, ASL is graphic by nature. It's expressive. If you sign vagina, it looks like a vagina. There's no way around it. Like that's the sign for that. There's no, and so the humor of kind of what is already an awkward situation also has this cultural difference of here's her hearing friend, and yet her parents, are
miming the actual condom and doing that. It's like so much worse than just saying use a condom. Yeah.
Right. And that's how you say ejaculate. I mean, I think the polite way to say it is to do it on your finger, not on your hand, but like, that's still how you're doing it. And so it was just so much fun. And I think to give Troy the freedom to be as inventive as he is, where in that scene, I mean, every time we did it, it was funnier and crazier and totally different. And there was 100 choices in the edit room because he was just playing with the language. And that was sort of the case all through the film, was kind of, and I remember going in and thinking like, is this joke work? Like this joke works for me because I obviously am a hearing person who writes. And when I'm writing and typing on my laptop, I'm hearing all the characters in my head. So I'm like hearing how a line works. And this was a process where I was like, oh, I'm never gonna hear this. I'm gonna watch it. And is that joke gonna work? Or is that joke gonna come alive? And I think particularly with the comedy, it was about just casting a really funny person that has his own timing, his own intense storytelling ability, and then letting him kind of use the script as a blueprint to take off and be free and come up with his own thing. And I think that's the freedom, like when you talk about, and I do get asked it a lot as I'm doing press for the movie, a lot of reporters are like, what were the challenges of working with deaf actors? As opposed to what was the opportunity of working with deaf actors, which was like, how would I have ever come up with that scene? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not inside of that experience. I don't express myself through that language. So the idea that, Troy could take something that I think was okay, funny on the page, but then make it, when you're in a theater and you watch that scene, that is probably the biggest laugh of the movie. Yeah. And so I don't know, it was just the challenges for me on this film were honestly the music and the fishing. Right. And it's like the focus on communication that we needed to figure out how a set could be accessible and work and how everybody could like freely communicate, because it had taken so much attention and focus to plan it in a way that was pretty seamless on set. Right. And then it became about like, well, how the fuck do we go out with 7 boats and go 3 miles
logistics
and like, go fishing. But I guess I think, I think what people are missing about authentic casting these days is like, you don't do it because it's the right thing to do. You do it because it's additive creatively.
It makes a wonderful film.
And it makes a wonderful film. And Troy doesn't have to think about playing deaf because he never thinks about playing deaf. He is deaf. Like that's his lived experience. Yeah. He gets to dig into this character, all the other things that make this guy who he is, what that means to be a fisherman and get up every day at 3 a.m. and not have a social life because you're out on your boat and you're exhausted every night when you come out, like, or be losing your way of life and be worried about the fact that your son might not want to pursue this and your daughter might want to pursue this. Like the deafness is an aspect of who they are. It's not who they are. Yeah. And right. So I think that's
the same way that like, you're not a fisherman and that you're not a singer and that you're not deaf. Like, I think it's so important for us to be able to go and tell stories that might not be our own, that we relate to in a very deep way, and then to bring them to other people. Like you happen to be somebody who can bring a story to a lot of people.
Yes.
You happen to be.
But I couldn't bring that story I couldn't have told this story if I did not have Alexandria and have Anne and have my friend Hillary back, who was reading the script, and have, it's like, I think that's an interesting conversation we're in right now, is whose story is who's to tell. I mean, there's a line in the deaf community that's on the, National Association for the Deaf website of media guidelines, which is nothing about us without us. And
we say this at the DGA all the time to leadership with all the diversity committees. Nothing about us without us. No press releases, no committees, no programs, no speakers without us weighing in on it. It's very important.
That without us means meaningful collaboration. It doesn't mean bringing in a consultant at the end to put a stamp on it. And I think particularly also when you are dealing with a community that's been misrepresented and underrepresented for a really long time. And, you know, I feel like there was an incredible responsibility coming into this story to have, like you said, me be the storyteller conduit, but have the voices on set who were a team with me, honestly, because there wouldn't, and I don't know, you know, and I think that's the thing, you know, and I deal with it on Little America, which is a show I work on too, which is very culturally specific. And, but, you know, how do you have meaningful collaboration? Because I think it does take a team. And so to have hearing artists and deaf artists working together and create an environment where that is collaborative and there is meaningful conversation and discussion about every element of the film, I think that was my goal going in. And that's sort of, I think the key to, because there's a lot of resistance to like, what are we only supposed to tell our own stories now? And am I stuck, you know, and it's like, well, no, but do your research and make sure that you have people who've lived that experience that have a meaningful voice in the process.
Right. And by the way, but then it makes sense that the roots of the creation of the work has to change. Right. The same way we want the tree to be different. We want the whole picture to be different, but then you have to dig down into the roots and change the process and change what that conversation is from the get-go of the project. Okay, so let's talk really quickly. I do want to talk about, I'm going to skip rehearsal because I feel like we've talked about the actors and the scenes, but I do want to hear about shooting a little bit and just like, how are you managing out on a fishing boat when you've got like, I mean, I've shot on the ocean. It's not for the faint of heart. People are puking and it's insane. And you're still managing to get these really lovely performances. So I want to hear like specifically about the balance of that really difficult indie film energy and still focusing on what you know matters at the end of the day.
I think you never have enough time, right? And you never have enough money. And so it's sort of like that thing. I mean, they are tied together because I think the rehearsal, the learning to fish was a huge key element of our rehearsal process that bonded this cast in a way that I also never would have expected, which I think when people talk about, you know, Amelia and Troy and Daniel and Marley was not out fishing with us, but Marley became a mom on that set in her own way and was hosting dinners and having everybody over on the weekends. But the way that Troy and Amelia and Daniel met was meeting down at the docks at 3 a.m. with me to go out with a local fisherman on his dragger boat.
Love it.
To figure out how to fish. And we had local fishermen guys that were teaching us. And I had fishing doubles ready to go. Like I was like, okay, these guys will sort of get the hang of it. And then I will have doubles to do the hard shit of pulling in the nets and sorting and they didn't. I never used a double. They learned how to do everything. You know, Troy, which is so weird because he's from Arizona and like, I don't know why, but is like a total natural on the boat. Like he just would master it like that. And he was tying off the line and he would watch something once and then he could do it. And I think, but it was interesting also to watch these local fishermen kind of at first go like, wait, you want me to teach an actor to learn how to fish? And then it was like, wait, you want me to teach a deaf guy to learn how to fish? Like, what are you talking? Like, how am I supposed to do that? And I'm like, guys, figure it out. And like, and then you realized when we got out on the boats, the engines were so loud that those guys signed to each other. They don't yell at each other over the fishermen had their own. And it was so interesting. And Troy was picking up on it. Like, he was like, wait, you guys stop the winch like this. And they were like, oh yeah, I guess we do. That's our sign. Cause you can't hear each other over the engines. So it was really cool.
It makes me want to cry. Like, that's like the most beautiful.
It was so exciting because also then Troy was like, let's incorporate and, you know, finding a sign for the fish. It's like, they kept pulling up as we were sorting the fish, like the squid and the monkfish and the lobster and all these things that are in the nets that Troy, you know, Daniel was calling monkfish like ugly fish. And Troy was doing this because they had the little like angler thing. And then they would debate what sign they would want to use, like that they would. So, and Amelia was a part of that. And Amelia was a badass. I mean, she's a 17-year-old girl. I had no idea if she would be able to hang in that situation. And she was like gutting cod and throwing the guts over her shoulder, like no problem. And so we went out a bunch of times, and we went out probably 4 times with local guys, and they would every time do a little bit more and be sorting the fish or pulling in the nets or doing the whole thing. So by the time we shot, what was amazing is that we could sort of shoot doc style. It was like those guys were just fishing, and I was filming them with 2 cameras, like almost like free, you know, there wasn't an opportunity to light really. We had so many boats with us. We had, you know, the Angela Rose, which was the boat that we were using, which was tiny. We could only have like 11 people on that boat tops, and that was pushing it. So
And that's including the actors.
Including the actors.
Yeah.
So I had like my camera operators, 1 assistant, no art department, no makeup person, no, you know, and then we had a whale watch boat that was like our crew boat. We had a, you know, picture boat with a techno crane on it. We had a camera boat with a techno crane on it. We had safety boats, shuttle boats going, you know, so I think we had 7 boats. But in order to transfer boat to boat, you had to jump. You had to basically wait till the waves were aligned and jump.
Yep.
You know, I had this amazing marine crew that was keeping everybody safe. But yes, people are puking, interpreters are puking, you know, people are. And so, but what I loved about it is it did feel like a throwback to like film school style, you know, where I was powdering Amelia between takes, and then I was picking up fish and dumping them bin to bin because we didn't have an art department person on board who could move the fish. So it was just me or my AD that were doing it together. And so all of those things, I think, lead to a kind of camaraderie on a movie where you feel like, oh, we're on a voyage. We're all in this together. It's insane, but we're in it. And I think it bonded the fact that those were kind of the early things, that rehearsal process. And people talk about this family feeling like a real family. And I think part of it was that like they'd been out working at sea for 2 weeks together, you know, and Amelia and Daniel would give each other shit, and Daniel couldn't tie a knot to save his life, and Amelia would tease him about it all the time. And so by the time we get to that brother-sister relationship on set, it's real, you know, because they have that familiarity and that, and you don't get that rehearsal a lot of times on a film.
Right. Or if you do, it's like in some office somewhere, and it feels so tricky to try to like, be like, okay, let's force this sort of intimacy. Okay. So I think we have time to show that scene that I love. That is a really great segue off of this, which is You Can't Stay Here, because I feel like their sibling relationship in this film is, so honest. And, you know, you and I were talking briefly before we got on this Zoom about, how, you know, it's so easy as a filmmaker to sort of lean towards villainization, to drive a plot, to lean towards a bad guy, just doing, you know, antagonistic things. And all the conflict in this movie is just built out of varying perspectives, varying needs, and love. And so is there anything you want to set up before we watch this? Just my favorite film.
That was perfect. I mean, like, do you want to, I want you to talk about the movie.
I love this.
Exactly right. It's like, you know, I guess to me, it's a true family drama. And that, like you said, the villain is conflicted feelings and family and dysfunction.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I mean, I don't have that in my family. I don't know.
No. Me too. Perfect over here.
Oh, he's so good. He's so good.
Good. So is she. They're so good.
They're so good. So talk about, because you mentioned too that this scene was like a scramble in some way. So
It was a scramble because we had lost our location. We were originally, I was supposed to shoot it at the house. I mean, the amazing part of shooting in the place that you wrote it for, which we got to do, is that you get to discover the town in prep, and you get to kind of have all these places that you have an intimate connection to, and you can shoot anything. It's not like you're in Atlanta pretending it's Florida, throwing Spanish moss into the trees and you can't point your camera that way. You can, like, we could explore the whole town, and the whole town was like our palette. And so Lane's Cove, that location, was a place that we'd like passed on a scout to somewhere else. And it was like, when we were in the shit with that scene and where do we move it? And like, it was like, let's go to Lane's Cove. Like, let's just go there. And what I love about that scene is these kind of character layers of Ruby, who has sort of acted put upon and you know, as though she has no choice but to do this. I love that she gets called out on her shit in that scene, and it's like she is getting a lot out of this too, and she is meddling where she's not always needed or wanted, and she is like been just as big a part of creating this kind of codependent relationship, because I think a lot of the feeling that CODA has described to me is, yes, sure, I had to grow up maybe before I was ready, and I had to be a part of these adult conversations, but also it gave me like a real sense of importance and control at a young age, where I felt like I was controlling the conversation and the adults were looking to me, and I could choose what to translate or not translate. Like,
right.
And there was kind of a real sense of self-worth and self-importance. And when she doesn't know who she is out there in the world, it's hard to let that go, that feeling of being in control.
Mhm.
And I love that Leo calls her on that when she says, you know, you're going to have to talk to hearing people. And he says, so what? Like, let them figure out how to deal with deaf people.
Yeah.
And for Daniel, I mean, what he brought in that scene was so powerful. And I think he understands Leo so well, because I think the frustration at, yes, it's helpful. Yes, sure, having a hearing person jump into a conversation. And yet at the same time, so much of it is about just like overcoming those boundaries, like letting a hearing person get over their awkwardness and figure out the tool that they have to communicate, which we have many at our disposal. You know, you can pull out a pen and paper, you can pull out your phone and text, you can gesture with your body, you can act it out on your face, you can, but yet there's a lot of like, you know, well, I don't know how to do that. And I watch even people I know really well and who seem like they would overcome it, get very uncomfortable when they're confronted, like, well, I don't know, I don't want to offend someone, I don't. So I think that idea of like that Ruby is actually like standing in the way of this family, the Rossies, being able to be a part of the town.
Mhm.
Because in a way, by being there and by constantly intervening and constantly being in the middle of that, she's keeping them away from the community and the community away from them, and keeping everyone from having to grow. So I just love that scene from a storytelling point of view. I also just love the performances. I think Daniel is so connected in that scene. And just from a directorial point of view, I mean, having him yell at her, but have it be silent. And it feels like he's yelling. Like, I remember watching the wide, and, you know, normally as a director, you're using the wide to like establish and maybe use at the end or cut to once during the scene. I remember watching the wide and almost going, I might just want to shoot this in the wide. Because it was so incredibly expressive and angry and full of emotion.
And loud.
It's loud,
right?
It's like a really loud scene.
Yes.
And I loved that. And I did end up going into coverage because I wanted to see, you know, his performance was amazing and I didn't want to stay wide, but I really, in a way, did, because the language is just expressive and emotive in a way that you can't be in any other form. And so the cinematic potential of that, when I saw those moments that were just pure cinema, because you're watching an emotion, yes, appear like a dance. And that was very moving to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think also like I'm hearing you talk constantly about sort of embracing whatever is in front of you. Whatever is being presented in front of you is now like a gift to be had or to be rejected, right? But like to try to find yourself instead of resisting all of those things that are unexpected or that might be challenges, sort of playing into them and like leaning into them. And I know we didn't have a chance to show the family talk scene because I think we don't have enough time, but talk about framing him. So you did go into coverage, but you can't go into this.
No, and even us here, I mean, it depends. Like, yes, I could be here if an actor was willing to sign higher, if it was an intimate scene where they were signing here. But I really have noticed in even great movies that portray deaf people, when your hands are cut off, you are cutting off the language. And so these tools of going into close up to get an emotional moment, but then you're cutting off the language. So I didn't want to do that. You know, you do start to learn. My DP and I worked a lot in that family scene, which we didn't watch, but you know, you really need to cut to somebody. You cannot have a line happen off camera because you really need to be, the language is visual. And so for a deaf audience, I wanted all of the signs to be in frame, but it dictates a different cutting rhythm than you would normally have, because in a spoken dialogue scene, I might stay on you the whole scene because
and here's somebody else talking off camera.
And I'm talking and I'm hearing the emotion of that person's lines, but it's about you. So I'm staying on you. And so it was sort of like, how do I honor the perspective in the scene and yet still keep the language constantly in frame? And that was interesting. And that was a lot of work with my DP on blocking, on figuring out, you know, we could be over the shoulder, but if someone's signing up here, but you have them sign a little higher and you can be over the shoulder, but still capture the sign.
Right. There's the scene where she sees her parents fighting about the boat and you can just see what Marley is signing. Right. And that there's this like nice stacking. By the way, it reminded me of like, you know, before we had digital and before we were able to like capture every little thing in every little way, like Rosemary's Baby is blocked so well. Like if you watch the film is blocked and that the actors are staged so smartly, and it feels like this sort of, you know, you do this anyway, but it put you in a position to sort of even go further and to do it more.
Oh, and also there's no changing anything. Like once you capture, you know, and Amelia's talking about this, like we recorded all the singing live on set. So when we did both sides now at the end and she's singing and signing, I'm always going to choose the take where her signing is correct. I'm never going to choose the take where her singing is perfect. I'm going to go with the sign because that's on camera. So normally in an edit, when you're manipulating a scene and you go, shit, I forgot that line. Well, let me just be on the character's back and put it in their mouth and I'll slide in that line. And then I've got that piece of dialogue that I needed. And you can't do that in this case. So you're working with exactly what you have on camera. And so that was also interesting because we cut 36 scenes from this movie. Yeah, it was insane. I mean, I could make probably a whole other movie out of all the scenes that I cut from this movie. But again, it's hard to like rob from a scene and take that one piece
to like take a plot point
and throw it into that other scene because it's all signed and it's on camera. So you can't cheat.
How long did you edit for?
I think we had, 10 weeks.
That's it? You had 10 weeks?
No, maybe it was 12.
Oh, wow. That's fast.
It was pretty fast. I knit a lot of hats.
I saw that. I saw that you started knitting.
I found that to be the perfect editing activity because I was like, oh, my hands are doing something and I can, no, my editor was amazing. I think we found the movie honestly in the edit. Like there was so much, I'd done so much research and I had made every character have a full story. And then we got into the edit and it was like, it's about this family. It's just about the family. It doesn't, the drama of the fishing community, the drama of Mr. V and his own life, all these things that I kind of elaborated on.
You want to serve. Yeah, you want to serve.
You want to serve them. And then ultimately you realize like, oh, that's all there anyway. You know, yes, I cut the scene where you meet Mr. V's wife and child. You see all the child shit in his house.
Yes,
and when he says that moment, like, I've got a whole life that has nothing to do with you, you know that he does. You don't need to see them. So I think a lot of that was like my editor honestly pushing me to go, you know, I've never had anything change so much in the edit. And it was really like, we don't need it. We don't need it. We don't need it. What's the story? What's the story? What's the story? And just going back to that and throwing out all my babies, like scenes that I loved that were
But
great.
by the way, that's the process though, too,
Yeah.
right? Like he wouldn't have had that toy stuff in the background. It wouldn't have felt as real unless you had built a whole world for him in your head leading into it.
Totally.
I don't know if we have time, but I also really wanted to hear about your sound design, which I think is so beautiful because it's so much about her hearing, and the movie is so silent in the beginning.
Yes.
And I just want to hear sort of how that evolved for you from the script maybe into the edit.
Well, it was interesting. You talk about like being open to what you're seeing in front of you. And I remember getting into rehearsal and watching ASL scenes and suddenly going, this is not silent. This is so loud. Like when you say excited, your hands are hitting your clothing and there's the sound of like fingers brushing your clothing. If you're angry and your hands hit each other, or you say stop, you know, like those little intimate sounds are so alive and so bring out that being what it feels like to be in that family. So I remember loving Marley like on the first day, and she's like, why are you loving me? Nobody loves me. Like, I don't need to be, and I'm like, you do need to be loved because your breath.
And she, her breath and her sounds are like incredible.
Like all these kind of little emotive moments that were so important. And so my sound designer honestly was about like pulling out all of those sounds and finding every little piece of clothing, sound of, you know, so that you could be in those, because I didn't want score, and there's no score for the first third of the movie. And then there's some score creeps in, but the moment you scored those ASL scenes, the music took them over and it just became all about the music. And I think particularly for a hearing audience, like you're looking for like the sound to grab onto because we're used to that. And so I didn't want to use that in that way. And then really finding, you know, the balance between the music, the choir, how we were using music when we were taking it away, you know, the silent scene in the concert. I fought with a lot of sound designers who were like, just put something there, like put a tone or you know, just something even imperceptible that you just feel. And it was like,
no, it was their experience of the lackness of it, right? There's just this lack for them. They cannot.
Well, and that's not every deaf person. I mean, every deaf person has a different level of hearing, and like, you know, Marley wears a hearing aid, so she hears something. Troy and Daniel hear absolutely nothing. Mm-hmm. And so to me, the Rossies were deaf in that way, where they do not, you know, where they are experiencing silence, true silence. And it felt like it was romanticizing the experience to put something there to make a hearing audience go like, oh, that's what deafness must be, is that rumbling sound, you know, or whatever it is. So I think it was interesting. It was interesting to just kind of go like, it's okay for people to be uncomfortable. Like, it's okay for an audience to be like, did the sound go out for a second? You know, it's I'm okay with that, because I actually think like you've watched this family and you feel like you know them and you're attached to them at that point, but you don't know what it's like to be them. So it's just a moment of getting to be in that world fully.
And by the way, then that leads to the payoff when Troy is touching her throat, right? Like he's found another way in. He sees that he's missed it. He sees that he can't understand it. And that finding that other way in is like the resolve of that discomfort.
And finding that moment with my actors where, because Troy, you know, in a way, when we were shooting that scene and Troy was sort of not fully getting the vibrations from Amelia. And then it became Amelia saying, like, it was like, you guys work as a team, like, and Troy saying like louder, and Amelia, and it became less about the characters and more about like Troy saying, give this to me, Amelia, and Amelia trying. And then the intimacy that's created from working together at something, which is less about this kind of hearing perspective that somehow he magically gets music in that moment, which is not what the scene is about, but it's about being intimate with your daughter and that closeness and that touch and the striving for understanding between them. Action that like, that's the scene. And I remember the little moment at the end of that scene, because he she looks at him with this look that's like, did you get it, kind of. And I love that he makes this face that's kind of like maybe, maybe not, but it doesn't matter. Like, yeah, sure, I got it. But it's like, but it's not about that. So I actually think like a lot of those moments were true discoveries, which I think like I do a lot of prep and shot listing, and I'm heavy prepper, but then I think it's so you can let go
Yeah.
in the moment and kind of allow something real to happen on screen and allow for discovery and be coming from a place of being open and not knowing until it happens.
Yeah.
So it's interesting though. And Amelia, had never had a voice lesson before. So her voice was growing a lot as we were shooting and we were recording live on set. So a lot of the breakthroughs vocally were happening real time.
Yeah.
So we would do a take and she'd be like, it came out of me. And it was coming out of Ruby at the same time that it was coming out of Amelia. And we were
right. And you can't fake that. You can't like rewind her back. Okay. Yeah. So I think we probably have time for one more. So I want to sort of hear, I know you premiered at Sundance during COVID. Yes. And I know you watched it with your family on your couch and you were like helping your mom with her app or Sundance app or whatever. Yeah. But so tell me, like, take me through that experience. And also, when did you get to see it in a theater with an audience? And what was that like?
Well, it was so surreal to have never seen the movie. And yes, to be at Sundance, like on the phone with my mom and all of her friends being like, Mom, just, okay, download the app. Okay. Do you have an HDMI cable? Like hook it up to, and I'm like, and then we're sitting there and I'm reading all the subtitles out loud to my 5-year-old who like can't read yet. And my 7-year-old is going like, what's a twat waffle? And I'm like, yeah, that's like maybe not appropriate for our kids. So it was really surreal. And then it was also surreal to have like the Sundance that every filmmaker dreams of, but like not have, like.
No, it's like everything. You got the everything Sundance buffet, like
the
sale, the awards, the like everything.
It was just like, and it was like, it was like a Zoom being like, and you won the audience, where he'd be like, yay. And I'd run it out of my office and I'd be like, David, to my husband, I'd be like, we won another thing. He'd be like, great. And then I'd kind of like go back to Zoom. And it was just like so weird. And then I remember we were sitting in the kitchen that night and we were like eating like leftover Thai food. And we're like, well, we should do a shot of tequila or something, like this should be something. So I hadn't ever seen it with an audience. I went to Gloucester this summer. And while we were in Gloucester, because my family goes there every year, and we, had been going there every year before I made the movie, and then it's become even a more special place. And so we were in Gloucester, and I was like, I really want to do a screening in Gloucester for the crew and the cast that's local and get to watch the film. And so Apple organized this amazing screening in Gloucester, and that was the first time that I'd ever seen the movie with an audience. And my husband was saying, he's like, you looked like a little kid. Cause I was like, they laughed. Like, oh, it's funny. Cause like, I think all anybody had told me was like that people cry, like, oh, I ugly cried at the end of the movie. And I'm like, but hearing the laughs and hearing how much people do laugh, was a really big deal. It was also hilarious because in that silent scene, 2 of the people that you look at are my parents, my real parents. So I had put them in the scene, the concert.
Oh, they're actually in the scene.
My parents are like I think it's a shot of a woman, then it's a shot of a couple, and it's my actual parents. And they had brought a lot of their friends to the screen. So at that moment, which is supposed to be so intense and silent and like in this world, everybody was like, it's Mags. Like, no, everybody like chill out. Like, so what? They're in a movie, but like
you're breaking the moment. Nobody knows who it is. Oh my gosh.
No, it was cute. I mean, also my dad like kept looking straight into camera. So shooting a concert scene with like 300 extras when I have to keep walking up to my dad and being like, Dad, you're looking directly down the barrel of the lens. And he's like, no, I'm like, you are, I can see you. I'm actually at the monitor watching. So.
I bet he loved that. I bet he loved just being like pressed down by his daughter.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, congratulations.
So bad to have to come in and cut you guys off because I wish you could keep talking the rest of the afternoon about this. It's been a fascinating conversation. Can't believe you had to cut 36 scenes. 36 scenes.
I cut them. I did cut them. Yes.
Yes.
Nobody forced me.
Exactly. This movie is really magical. If you haven't seen it yet and you're watching, please go see it right now on Apple TV Plus. Make sure you have tissues next to you. You will need them. There is a lot of laughter. I watched it immediately, I watched it by myself first and then immediately with my family. And then we watched it again and again. That ending gets me every time. It's exactly what you guys were describing in this time of tumult, is a family trying to find a connection and find their way through so much change. and it's just perfectly timed. So thank you for the gift that you gave us with this movie. Thank you, Tara, so much for moderating this conversation so beautifully.
Honor.
We wish you both much continued success, and please don't forget to tag AWD, Tara, and Sean in your posts and retweets at AWD_directors, at SienHeder.director, and at Tara_Miele. We will send you those hashtags a little bit later. For right now, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us.
Thank you, Tara, and thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Great
Tara
job.
and I need to go to coffee and just like keep talking.
Or tequila. Yes, absolutely.
Tequila,
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.